She was dying, and no one cared. The wind screamed around her as the world turned a deeper shade of cold. Glass towers loomed above in silence, reflecting the pale light of the stars, their mirrored surfaces too perfect, too clean, utterly indifferent. Her bare feet bled against the polished stone beneath her, blood freezing the instant it touched the surface. The city thrived. The city gleamed. The city ignored her. She staggered forward, each step an effort pulled from a body on the edge of collapse. Her breath came in short, rapid clouds of mist. The air tasted of metal and ozone, and pain followed her like a shadow. Her limbs no longer obeyed her commands properly. She couldn't feel the tips of her fingers anymore. The first door had no response. A slick black panel embedded in an elegant wall scanned her silently, blinked red, and retracted into a seamless facade. The second did not scan at all. The camera lens simply followed her face, then the door shimmered with a shield and she could feel it. Rejection without a single word. She tried again. And again. The third door hissed and made a whirring noise before cutting off the communication interface halfway through her plea. The fourth blared a warning in a tongue she didn't understand but recognized well enough. Stay away. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind kept her moving. Hunger had long been replaced by dull numbness. The only thing that drove her forward was memory of what it had been like before the machines came, before her people were slaughtered, before she escaped through the atmosphere of a dying world in a stolen ship not meant to carry anyone. Now, this was what survival looked like. By the time she reached the sixth door, she stopped knocking with her hand and started using her forehead. It hurt less. The cold was a constant now, like background noise. Her vision began to blur at the edges. Lights stretched unnaturally. Sound dulled. She didn't know this city's name. It had looked warm from orbit. The data node said it was neutral territory. Safe. Safe. The seventh door shimmered, acknowledged her species classification, then delivered a direct sonic burst meant to incapacitate. She dropped to her knees, whimpering, clawing her way to the next doorstep. She didn't notice the time anymore. Everything came down to one rhythm: knock, beg, fall, rise, shuffle. At the 10th door, she heard voices behind it, laughing. Laughter. She smiled. Maybe they'd help. She said words in every language she knew. But the door didn't open. The laughter didn't stop either. Her knees gave out 2 doors later. She crawled the rest of the way, dragging herself with shaking arms that felt more like dying roots than living limbs. At door 14, a tiny port opened, sprayed her with anti-contamination mist, then closed without comment. They had sanitized her presence without granting her entry. Door 15 was worse. It opened. A figure stood on the threshold. Tall, elegant, crystalline eyes that gleamed with calculation. She tried to speak. The figure saw her face, burnt, alien, desperate, and simply turned its back. The door sealed again. A gust of warm air brushed her as it closed, almost mockingly. She could have wept, but her body had no water left. The 16th door made her laugh. There was no real reason. Maybe the delirium. Maybe because the number was close to the end. Maybe because the door itself had no sensors. Just a slab of stone and light. No one responded. No one ever would. She knocked on the 17th door with her head. It was the only part of her that still moved without needing permission. When nothing happened, she lay still for a long moment. Her breathing slowed. Her fingers curled under her body for warmth. There was no warmth. The stars above blinked in patterns she no longer had the strength to interpret. Her mind wandered back to her mother's voice. Her father's gentle touch. The feeling of lying under the blue trees of her world's equator and staring up at constellations that no longer existed. Something inside her urged movement. Not the body. That was done. But the soul, whatever was left of it, whispered, "Try once more." Her body protested with every neuron. She felt detached from it, a ghost dragging a corpse. She didn't know how she found the next door. The world around her had dissolved into soundless fog. Her mind latched onto the number 18. It was an ugly door. Rusted. Wooden edges. The technology was old. She could feel it before she even touched the panel. No voice activation. No scanning drones. Just a place. She didn't knock. Her body collapsed against it. The surface was rough and warm from internal heating. That was new. Her vision dimmed. A last breath escaped her, ragged and cold. She expected nothing. But the door opened. No alarms. No threats. No rejections. It simply opened. Warmth hit her like a wave. Her ears registered a soft hum, and through the haze she saw something impossible. A face. It was not symmetrical. The skin was rough in places. The eyes were sunken. The jaw was unarmored. It didn't shimmer or glow or calculate. It simply looked human. He stared at her for half a second. Then, without a word, stepped forward and caught her as she collapsed. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was his hand on her shoulder, solid, warm, real. The doors shut behind them. The man didn't speak, but he carried her inside. Her body was a dead weight in his arms, and the seconds stretched long as he moved with an urgency she couldn't comprehend. She could still feel the cold of the outside world clinging to her skin, but the warmth in his grasp slowly pulled her from the edge of oblivion. A strange sensation, something close to life, began to return to her limbs. She could feel the air in her lungs again, the subtle shift of oxygen filling the spaces that had been deprived for so long. Still, her thoughts were clouded, sluggish. She didn't know what he looked like. His face had been a blur in her fevered mind, and the exhaustion numbed her senses. What she did know, however, was that he had not turned her away. He had opened the door. He had let her in. That simple act, that small choice, resonated deep within her. She was alien, and to the universe, she was nothing but a discarded fragment of an extinct species. She was supposed to be forgotten. But not by him. She had been a stranger to this world, a desperate wanderer from a place far beyond the stars. A species on the verge of extinction, scattered across the reaches of space, hunted by those who saw them as a threat. She had survived, barely, but she had lost so much along the way. The last of her kind. But here, in his arms, there was something that made her question the bleakness of her existence. Maybe she wasn't entirely alone. When she regained full consciousness, the first thing she noticed was how quiet it was. There was no hum of machines, no sterile, mechanical air. No overwhelming pressure from the artificial atmosphere that cities often imposed. It was peaceful. Safe. Her mind lingered on that feeling, unfamiliar yet undeniably present. She opened her eyes, but it was the warmth of the space she felt more than the light. It was like being embraced by the earth itself, like nothing was rushing her forward. For once, there was no urgency to survive, no constant battle against the world that had always rejected her. His presence beside her anchored her. She felt him sit, his weight shifting as he placed something beside her, something soft and warm. She could hear his breathing, steady, measured. He didn't speak, and she didn't force words past the knot in her throat. Instead, she focused on the warmth, the simple comfort that came from not being alone. From being seen. Not as a threat. Not as a weakness. Just another life in need. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable but familiar in its own way. When he did speak, it wasn't to ask her questions. It wasn't to demand answers. He simply asked her name. A question that was almost trivial. It was human. It was compassionate. Yelena. It felt foreign on her lips, but she said it anyway. It was her name. Her true name. She wasn't sure when she had lost that piece of herself, but hearing it again was like remembering an old song she had forgotten. She was Yelena, not a species, not a relic of a dead world. She was a person. He nodded as if that small answer meant something to him. A slight acknowledgement of her humanity, or whatever remnants of it were left. The exchange was brief, but it was enough. She could feel his eyes on her now, soft, patient, giving her the time she needed. Yelena took in her surroundings slowly, scanning the room. The decor was simple, humble even, nothing like the towering spires of the cities that had rejected her. There were no metallic surfaces, no glittering lights. Just a few pieces of worn furniture, the walls painted in warm, earthy tones. A contrast to the cold, lifeless city outside. There were bookshelves lined with old texts, and the faint scent of wood and fire lingered in the air. It smelled like life. Like a home. She felt his presence shift as he stood. His silhouette moved in the periphery of her vision, but she didn't reach for him, didn't ask for his attention. She knew, somehow, that he wasn't going to abandon her. He didn't need to keep reminding her that he cared. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. He came back after a moment, placing something in her hands. She looked down. A cup. Steam rose from it, carrying the smell of something warm, tea perhaps, or broth. The simple gesture was almost too much. For so long, she had wandered in the dark, trying to find something to hold on to, trying to survive in a world that had turned its back on her. She hadn't expected kindness, especially not from a species that didn't know her, didn't understand her. Yet here he was, offering her something that spoke louder than any plea for help could. It was trust. The warmth of the drink radiated through her hands as she took a sip. The liquid was rich and soothing, and she swallowed without hesitation. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the sharp bite of hunger gnawing at her. Her mind cleared a little more with every sip, and a weight began to lift from her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. As she drank, she realized something crucial. He wasn't afraid of her. He had opened his door to her without hesitation, without fear. Humans. They didn't view her as a danger. They saw her for what she was, vulnerable, scared, just another lost being trying to find her way. She wasn't an enemy. She wasn't a monster. It was something she hadn't dared to believe for so long. The quiet stretched between them, but it was no longer oppressive. There was no need to fill the silence with words. She felt safe in the presence of someone who saw her, as she truly was. A person. When she finished her drink, he offered no questions. There were no demands, no expectations. He just let her be. And for the first time since she had fled her planet, since she had run for her life across the cold vacuum of space, Yelena allowed herself to relax. She was alive. She was not alone. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was hope in a world where a human opened their door to an alien woman in need. Yelena's recovery was not instant, but it was steady, and it carried a kind of grace she didn't recognize at first. Her body healed faster than her thoughts, which often drifted into the silence of space, haunted by the screams of a planet that no longer existed. Yet, the man never asked about her origin. He never once demanded her story. Instead, he showed her how to be present. How to be human, or at least how to find comfort in the small things again. She learned his name in passing, Caleb. He didn't wear it like a title. He said it plainly, with a shrug, as though it wasn't a name that had ever meant anything to anyone. But to her, it was the first name she had heard in weeks that didn't bring pain. It became something safe, something to anchor herself to when the memories tried to drag her back into the cold. Caleb's house was old. Not broken, just lived in. She observed the wear on the wood, the faded fabric on the couch, the slight unevenness in the floor. And yet, these imperfections gave it life. They whispered of years gone by, not of suffering, but of survival. Yelena saw photos on the shelves, smiling faces she didn't recognize, and she understood them without needing to ask. Caleb had lost people. The silence in the house had a texture she recognized, absence. In this quiet world, she slowly rediscovered her strength. Her fingers stopped trembling. Her body grew steadier. But it was her thoughts that changed most. She began to watch Caleb closely, not out of suspicion but from something closer to reverence. The way he treated her, with dignity and patience, stood in sharp contrast to everything she had experienced. Humanity, she had been told, was a dangerous species. They were war makers, prideful, selfish. but the man in front of her proved that judgment shallow. Yelena found herself remembering her people, not in pain, but with quiet fondness. They, too, had been misunderstood. They had reached out to other civilizations, sought peace, even as their enemies closed in. But no one had let them in. Not until Earth. Not until Caleb. As the days passed, Caleb introduced her to routines. Nothing grand, just habits. They shared quiet meals. He made food and showed her how to use simple human tools. He let her sit in silence or speak when she was ready. It was never forced. It was human in a way that transcended species. She mimicked his behaviors, not to imitate but to understand. The way he placed a blanket around her shoulders, or brought her water without being asked. The way he turned off the lights in the hallway at night because he noticed she startled easily. And she did startle. Even now, shadows reminded her of steel boots, of ships descending from the sky, of explosions that erased entire cities. She could still feel the pain in her bones from the impact of an orbital strike. But these things were fading, like ink in water, slowly dispersing into something calmer. Because now, she woke up under a roof, not under stars that no longer recognized her. Caleb didn't talk about the world much. Occasionally, she would catch glimpses of it, snippets of the news playing quietly in the background, headlines that mentioned economic shifts, border disputes, natural disasters. Earth, like every world, was flawed. And yet, there was an undeniable strength in its people. They endured. Not through dominance, but through an odd and stubborn kindness. Yelena didn't understand it at first. Why would someone like Caleb help a stranger? Especially one not from this world? But she was beginning to realize that his actions weren't based on logic or strategy. They were based on choice. And that made all the difference. One morning, as the sun stretched across the windows and painted the room in soft gold, Yelena stood and walked on her own. Caleb didn't celebrate, didn't make a scene. He simply smiled and nodded. That quiet acknowledgement meant more to her than words ever could. She wasn't a burden anymore. She wasn't weak. She was beginning to live again. But healing came with responsibility. Yelena knew she couldn't stay forever. Not hidden in this quiet place, not with the ghosts of her past waiting beyond the horizon. Caleb seemed to understand this without being told. One evening, he handed her an old jacket. His. It didn't fit perfectly, but she wore it like armor. Not to protect herself from the world, but as a reminder of what kindness could look like. Yelena began learning about Earth more deliberately. She accessed the old data systems Caleb kept in a dusty cabinet. She read history, science, even poetry. She wanted to understand not just humanity, but this world's pain and resilience. The more she learned, the more she admired them. Humans were not the monsters the galaxy feared. They were fractured, yes, but they rebuilt. They carried each other when no one else would. And perhaps, in their own chaotic way, they were more evolved than those who had labeled them as lesser. Yelena realized she had something the galaxy needed, not power, not knowledge, but truth. The truth that humans could be trusted. That among them lived people like Caleb, who opened doors when everyone else shut theirs. She had wandered through 17 barriers, endured 17 rejections, and yet it only took one act of kindness to change everything. She didn't want revenge. She wanted to tell others that they were wrong about Earth. She wanted to carry this story, her story, into the stars, and let it burn through the darkness that had swallowed so many. Not with anger, but with hope. Caleb never asked her to stay. He never told her to leave either. He simply gave her the space to decide. And when she finally looked him in the eyes and said, "I think I'm ready," he nodded, just once. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her heart was heavier than she expected. Not with sorrow, but with meaning. What had started as a desperate plea in the night had become something bigger than survival. It had become testimony. Earth had opened its door. Caleb had answered. Now, she would carry that light into the void. The journey away from the small town was quiet. Yelena didn't look back. She carried no bag, no weapons, just the borrowed jacket and the calm resolve forged in warmth. Her destination wasn't fixed, it didn't need to be. The truth she carried was not one confined by coordinates. It was something she intended to share, even if only a few would listen. The world outside Caleb's home was sharp again, filled with noise and suspicion, but it no longer frightened her. She had changed. What had begun as survival had become purpose. She boarded a transport bound for the coastal city, where she had read there were more refugee networks, some official, most secret. Earth, though not united, had developed small webs of outreach after discovering they weren't alone in the universe. Not all aliens were welcome, and certainly not trusted, but there were always people who did not follow the official script. She had a face now, a voice, a confidence that wasn't there before. When others looked at her, they didn't see a threat anymore. They saw someone quiet, maybe strange, but not dangerous. The cold stare she once carried had softened, replaced by something human: willingness. Her first contact was a man named Reed, a civilian coordinator loosely affiliated with one of Earth's fragmented refugee aid groups. He operated out of a warehouse, a converted fish processing facility, filled with battered containers and long-retired vehicles. He asked her questions, not the kind that tried to dig at her identity, but the ones that tested her intent. She answered plainly. Not about her planet, not about her trauma. She spoke only of Caleb, of the door that opened, of the silence that healed. That story cut through the administrative tension. Reed didn't pretend to understand, but he listened. Through him, Yelena gained access to communication equipment. It was outdated, patched with local components, but it worked. It gave her a voice. The message she composed was short, not poetic, not desperate. It simply declared that a survivor from the broken fringe of the galaxy had found refuge. Not through armies or treaties, but through a single act of human decency. She didn't ask for rescue or revenge. She offered an invitation, to listen, to reconsider. She sent it into the void using known emergency beacons still active in deep space. Maybe it would take years to reach the right ears. Maybe it wouldn't be heard at all. But it was sent. That was enough. Days passed with little response. She volunteered at the warehouse in exchange for food and shelter. She helped translate alien dialects, documented irregular arrivals, and even provided emotional support for others who, like her, had once been turned away. Some didn't trust her. Others clung to her like a symbol. She neither encouraged nor dismissed it. She knew better than to believe in icons. She was just one story. One result of a single decision made in the dark. Eventually, a reply came. Not a fleet or a delegation, just a voice transmission. Distorted, broken by distance, but unmistakably familiar. The language was hers. It was a scout vessel, one of the last patrols from her quadrant, searching for survivors. They had picked up the transmission and were requesting coordinates. Yelena paused before responding. She had dreamt of this moment, the contact, the chance to reconnect. But now that it was here, she felt hesitation. Her world had ended, but she had begun something new here. She was not the same being who had fled that night. Still, she gave them the information. She asked only that when they came, they come without weapons. She emphasized that she was safe, that Earth was not hostile, that her rescue had come not through force but through kindness. The scout agreed. The signal ended with a simple acknowledgement. We will come in peace. We will come to listen. That night Yelena sat alone on the rooftop of the warehouse. The sky was cloudy, stars blurred. She didn't feel small anymore. She felt positioned, as though all of this, the terror, the doors, Caleb, had placed her exactly where she needed to be. She thought of how many worlds might still reject the message she sent. How many might ignore it or bury it beneath bureaucracy. But some wouldn't. Some would understand. She didn't need the galaxy to change all at once. Just one more person like Caleb. Just one more door opened. Over the following weeks, the warehouse transformed into a communication hub. Other species began to respond cautiously. Not in large numbers, not with coordinated diplomacy, but with individual stories. a scientist from a scorched moon station, a medic who had defected from a mercenary fleet, a mechanic who had escaped forced labor in the mining belts. Each had their own version of knocking on doors and being turned away. Yelena didn't offer salvation. She offered acknowledgement. And slowly, the image of humanity began to shift, not through propaganda or treaties, but through testimony. She never saw Caleb again. She sent him one message before the scout arrived. It contained no pleas, no gratitude, just a single line. "You answered the door, and now I understand why." He never replied. Maybe he never needed to. Maybe silence was his gift to her final transformation, a quiet ending, letting her grow without clinging to the past. When the scout ship descended, there was no fanfare. It came cloaked, low, cautious. Yelena met them not as a refugee, not as a victim, but as a witness. She told them her story, introduced them to Earth's messy but remarkable compassion. She warned them of the dangers, of the distrust, but she also reminded them of Caleb. Of what was possible when fear wasn't the first reaction. The scout took her message and left. Others would come. Not to invade, but to speak. Earth wasn't perfect, but it had something most advanced worlds had lost: the willingness to care without agenda. Yelena stayed on Earth. Not as a guest, but as someone who had chosen it. She worked with those like her. She trained others to understand cultural differences, to listen first before responding, to recognize that survival was only the beginning. What came next was rebuilding, and rebuilding required trust. She never asked for Earth's protection. She didn't need it. What she had received was far more rare. She had been seen. She had been accepted. And that was the beginning of everything that followed. The galaxy had expected Earth to be a threat. Yelena had found it to be something else entirely, a place where the 18th door opened, not because of policy or fear, but because a man decided not to be afraid. That decision had echoed through the stars. Now, it would not be forgotten. The winter passed. Snow melted into the gutters, the cold eased its grip, but the memory of that night, when Yelena had collapsed on Caleb's porch, remained etched in her like a scar that no longer hurt but never faded. Time had moved forward, and she had moved with it. Her name, once unfamiliar and whispered, was now spoken freely in scattered communities across the globe. She was no longer just a refugee. She was a reference point, a story that others used to prove humanity's capability for mercy in a galaxy dominated by calculation and fear. What began as a single act of kindness had unraveled into a slow but unstoppable chain of changes, many of them invisible, subtle shifts in behavior and perception. Earth's governments didn't issue official declarations or grand policies in her honor, but local networks, independent stations, and underground communication hubs had taken up her name. The 18th door became a quiet phrase in those circles, a symbol for the risk of one more try, the hope that maybe this door wouldn't close. The phrase outgrew Yelena. And she let it. She continued to work with refugee outreach teams, guiding both humans and aliens alike who had no interest in allegiance, only in surviving without being hunted. Most had seen horrors beyond human understanding: mass culling, psychic manipulation, planets turned into laboratories or labor zones. They didn't speak of heroism. They spoke of necessity. And in Yelena's calm eyes, many of them found an anchor. She did not offer them comfort through platitudes, but through recognition. She had been there. She had survived. And she had found a place where the rules were different. Caleb, unknown to the world, never sought recognition. He returned to his quiet life. He fixed windows, shoveled snow, kept to himself. But in his neighborhood, things changed. People who once double-locked their doors began leaving a light on. Small gestures. Small changes. The kind of shifts that don't trend on networks but dig deep into the fabric of culture. Not everyone trusted, not everyone welcomed, but the shift had begun. A recalibration of instinct. Not everyone feared first. Some of Yelena's people eventually arrived, not in fleets, but in ones and twos. She met them, helped them integrate, and told them the truth. That Earth was fractured but kind, unpredictable but worth the risk. Some didn't stay. Too much pain, too many reminders of loss. But others saw what she saw, a world not obsessed with power, but capable of it, not governed by fear, but aware of its consequences. Earth was rough, but it had space for those who had lost everything else. It was not a utopia. But for the broken, it was real. One of the last messages Yelena received from space came not from a survivor, but from a historian aboard a neutral vessel passing through the fringe sectors. The historian spoke of hearing her name on multiple stations, repeated in different dialects, often distorted but clearly recognizable. They asked her for the full story. She declined. Not out of secrecy, but because the story no longer belonged to her. What mattered wasn't the biography. It was the truth of what happened when someone opened a door instead of turning away. Her influence, though never sought, became a mirror. Other alien races began reconsidering their views of humans. Not all. Not quickly. But enough. Even some of the more militant factions paused to consider that the species they once labeled as unpredictable brutes might also be the only ones reckless enough to care. Reckless enough to help without calculation. Some called it weakness. Others knew better. They saw it for what it was, a power that made no sense to machines or empires. The power to let someone in when everything told you to turn them away. Years passed. Yelena aged differently than humans, her biology slower, but her features began to mirror Earth's patterns, rougher skin from wind, softer expressions from laughter. She stayed in contact with other refugees, and as Earth built more integrated shelters, she advocated not as a politician or a representative, but as a witness. Her strength came from that first night, the choice Caleb made without knowing who she was, what she could bring, or whether he'd regret it. That single moment continued to shape policy not through force, but through story. By the time Earth was invited to a broader council of fringe civilizations, an invitation once thought impossible, Yelena's name was unofficially cited in every proposal. Not because she had fought, but because she had been saved. Because in a universe defined by reaction and retaliation, someone had acted without agenda. It was a gesture that rewrote expectations. And the galaxy paid attention. When she finally stood before that council, she didn't speak long. She didn't bring data or arguments. She told them what happened on Earth, in the snow, when a human named Caleb opened a door after 17 others didn't. She told them that he never asked where she came from. That he didn't care about consequences. That he gave her food before he asked her name. Then she said nothing more. The room stayed quiet for a long time after. Afterward, as she left the chamber, one of the older delegates, non-human, scaled voice like crushed leaves, approached her and simply said, "We thought humanity would bring war. Instead, they brought a door." That was enough. Yelena returned to Earth quietly. Her face was more widely known now, and in some cities, murals of the 18th door appeared, never depicting her, always showing the door itself, slightly ajar, with warmth spilling through. People didn't need to know her story to feel its weight. They just had to know that sometimes, the difference between life and death was whether someone answered a knock. Caleb died before she could see him again. Quietly in his sleep, as was his way. Yelena attended the funeral in silence, standing apart from the others, who didn't know her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The wind was cold, but it didn't reach her the way it once had. She walked back alone, coat tight, chin high. She wasn't mourning. She was carrying forward. The door had been opened, and it had never fully closed again. Behind her, Earth hummed with a future shaped not by force, but by the simple bravery of kindness. That, in the end, was the most human thing of all. And that was what saved her. That was what would save the rest.